This is Audible.
William Whitecloud, Secrets of Natural Success. 5 Steps to Unlocking Your Genius. Narrated by Mike Cooper. Introduction. The Sufis say that light doesn't travel, it unfolds out of itself. Well, this book kind of happened that way. I did not sit down to write my commandments for living in alignment with creative spirit. Rather, I sat down with the intention of allowing creative spirit to dictate through me her instructions for engaging with her, for the purpose of co-creating brilliant outcomes in life, and most especially the sublime life all of us are quite capable of living. Chapter 3. The third step of natural success, preparing the fertile ground for your genius to emerge, in which we can escape the karma of our limited have-not paradigm and enjoy the fruits of living life on a high-level creative frequency, the state of being that is responsible for natural success. Chapter 3. The third step of natural success, preparing the fertile ground for your genius to emerge. Let me say categorically, trying to clear or get rid of unconscious beliefs is a waste of time. Worse, it only gives them more energy or power. The sophisticated creator knows that the subconscious is less informed by explicit statements and thought forms than it is by behavior. It is always inferring the underlying assumptions behind your actions and reactions, whether those assumptions reflect your unconscious beliefs or, as we'll be discussing, your superconscious wisdom, and being guided by those conclusions as to what it should create. When it sees you reactively polarizing against your beliefs, that is, compensating for them because you've put the power in them, your subconscious rightly concludes that you assume the beliefs have the power, and it will create a reality consistent with that conclusion. Of course, self-conscious intellectual concepts like whether there is a God or not, or if Earth is flat or round, can change. Views and opinions can easily be dispelled by contrary evidence, rational argument, peer attitudes, changed circumstances, and so on. But your unconscious beliefs, formed by your wounding in the individuation phase, orientate your ego. Because orientation is the name of the game for the ego, it has to remain faithful to those assumptions, no matter what evidence there is to the contrary. The point is, though, that you don't have to change your beliefs, you only have to change your focus. You only have to change what you put your energy in, and therefore give the power to. This book deals with shifting out of the dead-end struggle of compensating tendency or strategy into the ease and joy of high-level creative function. As we have established, low-level creative function is a result of being externally referenced or informed. This doesn't only mean what we take on board from outside ourselves currently, it also includes the input of our unconscious beliefs, which were originally derived from external circumstances involving others, our mother and father to be specific. Now we are going to learn how to tap into the genius within, our own inner source of wisdom and inspiration, something that very few people on the planet know how to do with any skill or consistency. We have all been thoroughly conditioned to believe that our highest creative faculty is not real, not valid, and that the non-rational ideas and insights that sometimes do manage to break through into our self-conscious awareness are highly suspect, if not downright dangerous. This is an important lesson, therefore, and not at all like learning some facts in school, such as the dates of famous battles in history. This chapter relates to the real education we all missed out on. In order to draw out or bring forth the genius that is our inherent birthright, we literally have to rescue our superconscious intelligence from the nebulous dreamscape it has been left to languish in and give it back its exalted place in the world of tangible, concrete knowledge. It falls to us to defy the societal taboos that keep us from expressing our full potential. Only we can awaken this giant capacity within ourselves and transform it into the guiding principle of our lives. The reason why there is such a preoccupation with belief clearing and self-healing and fixing in the modern-day self-help movement, which includes spiritual and personal development, is because of the pervading assumption that we are our wounds. But we are not our wounds. Our wounds are the chassis of the vehicle that transports who we really are through this thing called life. And as such, they should not be tampered with. Trying to resolve our illusion of separation and limitation only distracts us from the business of living out our whole, undented, undiminished, undaunted, and infinitely creative nature. There is no denying that it is relatively true that belief creates reality. As pure creative spirit, connected to everything through all time and space, we enter our egoic vehicle, which seeks validation of our nature. When that need is not met in some way, we hurt. We try to resolve that pain by explaining it to ourselves, and those explanations become concretized as unconscious beliefs. We become preoccupied with our beliefs because we assume that coping with those perceived limitations is what our life is all about. That unconscious preoccupation or focus gives our beliefs the power, and they begin manifesting as our reality, both in terms of our perception and our actual experience. To see a diagram of how our belief creates our reality, check the resources at williamwhitecloud.com/natural success bonus. As long as our unconscious dynamic has the power, then of course our subconscious manifestations, what we actually create in our lives, will reflect that focus. Everyone can prove their beliefs because they play out in their lives continually. But we don't have to be caught up in this cycle of limitation. Our subconscious can just as easily manifest a reflection of our superconscious potential if we divert our attention, our focus, to this higher aspect of consciousness. Operating on a high-level creative frequency from our genius is not an automatic function, though. It takes self-conscious action to effect that shift. And before you can take functional action in this respect, you have to be able to discern and distinguish your superconscious message from your unconscious message. Here, an appreciation of the different modes of awareness that serve these aspects is crucial. Fundamentally, we can say that there are two modes of awareness that we are informed by: perception, our egoic or unconscious mode of awareness, and intuition, our superconscious mode of awareness. By discussing perception and intuition, I don't just want to give you an insight into the nature of these modes and how they differ. I want to be sure that you appreciate the creative imperative of ceasing to identify with your perception and starting to develop a strategic relationship with your intuition. Without an understanding of how you process reality and how you can improve the quality of that process, you remain a fish in a fishbowl without knowing it, and without the means to leap into the wide open waters of natural success. Awareness is everything. The most astonishing story I've ever heard relating to the transition from unconscious awareness to superconscious awareness is the account of how the escape fire was invented. In rural Africa, where I grew up, fighting bushfires in winter was as normal as shoveling snow would be in Canada. A standard survival technique we used was controlled burns, which involved preemptively burning an area you could retreat into if the fire you were fighting got out of hand. It's just such an obvious tactic that I assumed the procedure had been around forever. But it turns out that the escape fire is a surprisingly modern practice, invented somewhat accidentally in the late 1940s by a man with the improbable name of Wag Dodge. Wag Dodge was a smoke jumper, which is what they called the heroic Montana firemen who parachuted into rough, inaccessible terrain to fight forest fires. One day, Wag and his crew of over a dozen men, of whom he was the leader, were fighting an out-of-control mountain fire fanned by a gale-force wind which suddenly turned on them as the wind changed direction. Wag and his smoke jumpers were pinned against a steep grass-covered hill by a 15-foot wall of flames bearing down on them at lightning speed. Terrified for their lives, they all turned and began scrambling frantically up the hill. Their leader knew that retreat was futile. There was no chance that they could outrun the advancing inferno. Wag Dodge felt the same terror that every other member of his team could feel, and his own terror's urgent call to flee for his life. But it was also sickeningly obvious to him that running would not save them from the murderous fire breathing down their necks. If there was any way of being saved, it was not running away. And if there was a solution, it could not occur to them while they were running. Overriding his own highly alarmed internal self-preservation system, Wag Dodge stopped in his tracks and called on his men to do the same. Though he ordered them, as their leader, to stand their ground, they ignored him, heeding rather the louder, dread-filled urging of their own terror. They continued stumbling their way up the rocky incline, desperately thrashing through the dry thatch that was fuel to the blaze that would in minutes engulf them. Wag couldn't blame them. He didn't have a better idea, just a sure certainty that if there were one, it wouldn't present itself to them in a blind panic. As Wag looked from his deserting comrades scrambling away from him, back to the giant flames closing in from behind, he suddenly realized that the answer was staring him in the face. Fire! He could set the grass where he stood alight, and if a big enough clearing could be burned off around him, he could conceivably be saved from being roasted alive. The same dry grass that was fuel to the inferno that would be the death of him could equally be his savior. There was no chance he could catch up with the other smoke jumpers and explain the plan to them. Wag had just enough time to set a match to some grass and fan the flames with his jacket. As his fire took and began blazing uphill, he retreated behind it into the ashes of the burnt-out thatch. Only a few minutes later, the main fire caught up with the squad leader and raged all around him, but he had burned off enough of a clearing to not be directly scorched by the monstrous flames. Not that he got off scot-free. Because he hadn't had time to burn a bigger break, he was still badly harmed by the fire. Wag ended up in hospital suffering serious burns and smoke inhalation. Nevertheless, his inspired idea to fight fire with fire had saved his life. He was one of only 2 smoke jumpers from his team who survived that terrible conflagration. You'll find many references to Wag Dodge's incredible story in articles and books related to creativity and intuition, because it illustrates so perfectly the dichotomy between unconscious and superconscious modes of awareness, as well as the process for switching from low-level creative function to high-level creative function, not to mention the benefits. If you think about the story, the key to it is that when Wag stopped running, he was no longer in reaction. When he literally stopped, he was no longer being driven by his charged emotions, and that is when he was able to make a connection between elements of reality that apparently no human had ever made before and formulate a life-saving solution. Through his self-conscious action, he unwittingly facilitated a shift in consciousness that led him to invent the escape fire. If you intend to shift from an egoic or low-level creative mode to a superconscious or high-level creative mode, then you have to change your relationship to emotions and cease identifying with them as a reflection of objective reality. What we now know, thanks to neuroscience, is that the function of emotion is to drive decisions. This was discovered with the advent of brain surgery. It was already known that the orbital front lobe, which is a part of the brain that sits behind our eyes, is our main emotional center. When the first operations were performed to remove cancer patients' orbital front lobe, it was anticipated that it would be beneficial to them, not only from a life-saving perspective, but also because it was thought that by not having emotions to cloud their judgments any longer, these individuals would become intellectually sharper. But what happened was that instead of becoming more rationally effective in life, they ended up being incapable of making the simplest of decisions, like what cereal to have for breakfast or which tie to wear to work. To you and me, these seem on the surface to be straightforward, uncomplicated considerations. But to the rational part of our brain, trying to compute the most optimum way to go in any situation, there are an infinite number of variables, as illustrated by the never-tiring cliché of a woman trying to decide what to wear to a party. There has to be some mechanism to force us into making a decision. And that's what we need our emotions for. To say, as urgently as the occasion demands, bloody hell, just wear the pearl earrings, or why don't we have cornflakes today, or fire, run! Our emotions present us with the bottom line of an unconscious computation of everything we know relevant to a decision, saving us the ponderous task of analyzing all of that information consciously. Because that computation occurs outside of our self-conscious awareness, we perceive it to be something we arrive at outside of our rational function, and think of it as some mysteriously independent emotional intelligence. But there is nothing irrational about the process. It's just happening instantaneously and out of sight. While this may be a massively convenient function in many ways, and might save us from overthinking getting out of a saber-toothed tiger's way, it also comes with a serious drawback. The limitation of emotions is that they are essentially only the sum of what we know from past experience, and, more damningly, from a creative perspective, mainly sum up the biases formed by the same past experience. In other words, emotions are a decision-making mechanism driven by our unconscious beliefs. The phenomenon of unconscious bias is well understood. Scientists have done many experiments devoted to this subject. One of the most widely referred to of these experiments is the blind wine tasting tests, where connoisseurs are told nothing about the wines they're judging other than the supposed price of each variety. So conditioned are we all with the notion of price as an indicator of quality that expert tasters uniformly judge the varieties assigned the higher prices to be the best, when in fact the prices of the superior and inferior wines have been intentionally switched. When I was living back in Australia, a friend of mine was trying to promote an international personal development guru without any success. She was advised to increase the price of the workshops by more than double what she was originally charging. As soon as she took the advice, places in the workshop started selling like hotcakes. All of the fundamental reasons for making the choice not to attend the event remained the same, but evidently the increase in cost unconsciously implied an increase in the guru's worth, which skewed more prospects to feel like signing up. If true logic had anything to do with it, the increased price should have deterred them even more. The Indian philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti was once asked what he considered the biggest impediment to enlightenment. He replied, "Identification with the senses. Our biggest stumbling block creatively is that we take our thoughts and feelings at face value as being true. We just assume that they reflect actual reality, and that whatever responses they propose are self-evidently the right ones. But our thoughts and feelings don't reflect actual reality. They reflect what we believe about reality from our past experience. And the responses they impose on us are also limited to strategies we learned in the past. Most people are startled to discover that their thoughts and feelings are not exactly relevant to whatever is occurring in any present moment. But it's true. You can't be in the now if you're identified with your thoughts and feelings, because they only reflect your past. Again, this is why the story of Wag Dodge and the escape fire is so relevant to creativity and intuition. Everything in Wag's and his team's experience told them, through the terror they felt, that they were about to suffer the most horrific consequences unless they took urgent action, and the only action available to them in their experience, as conveyed to them by their fear, was to run for their lives. That adrenaline-fueled terror commanded them to flee. What is exceptional about their leader is that something in his mind intervened, some kind of spontaneous inspiration, you could say, to impress on him the nonsensical, emotionally heretical conviction that his only hope lay in not running. We can't imagine the act of will it took for Wag to stand still in the face of his reaction to the oncoming fire. What we do know, though, is that when he stopped going along with his panicked emotions, his mind was suddenly able to make a leap in logic outside of his experience, to come up with an idea that no one had ever thought of before. Wag Dodge's story is a brilliant example of how, when we cease to identify with our senses, our thoughts and feelings, we create the fertile ground for our genius to emerge. Let me tell you another crazy story that illustrates the nature and power of perception. Back in the old days on our farm, vultures circling low in the sky over the savannah meant that something on the ground was either dead or dying. One day, a group of African herdsmen rounding up cattle for dipping were missing an ox from their herd. When they spotted a kettle of vultures circling close to a nearby hill, the herdsmen suspected that their missing ox might be in trouble, and a couple of them were dispatched to go and investigate. What they found, though, was not an animal, but a naked tribesman lying unconscious at the foot of a big leadwood tree, with the most horrific wounds all over his body. A vehicle was called in, and the man was transported to the farm infirmary, where he lay for days in a coma. The tribesman's presence at our little bush hospital caused quite a stir. His injuries were severe. His knees and elbows were dislocated. Deep lacerations covered his arms and torso and legs, and he had taken a massive blow to the crown of his head. And while he was unconscious, it remained a mystery as to the cause of his grievous condition. The herdsmen who found him were expert trackers. They could look at an antelope hoof print in the dust and tell you the species, whether it was male or female, how much it weighed, and the length of its horns, and they found no signs that could explain what had happened. For all anyone could tell, the man may as well have fallen from the sky. The farm managers, the attending doctor and nurses, and local police waited anxiously for him to recover. When finally the tribesman came around and was well enough to speak, the account he gave shocked everyone who had been waiting on tenterhooks to hear it. It turned out his wounds were self-inflicted. According to the man's solemn statement, he had taken a shortcut through the cattle section from a tribal settlement on one side of our farm to his own settlement on the other side. As was typical of tribesmen at that time, he was barefoot and dressed only in a Java print sarong and a jackal-skin beshu, a loincloth that native men usually wore over their sarongs. All he carried was his knobkerry fighting stick and an assegai, the short stabbing spear favoured by local warriors. As he walked along a path meandering through the savannah woodlands, he came across a clump of guinea fowl feathers, the only remains of a recent falcon kill. He knelt down to pick out a few choice flight feathers to adorn his hair with. After making his selection, he stood up again, at which moment a big black-maned lion walked out of the bush onto the path only a few steps in front of him. The warrior froze. There was nothing else he could think to do. He hadn't even collected his weapons, which were standing against a nearby tree. The lion broke the impasse by opening its mouth wide and letting out a fearsome roar. The man turned and fled back down the path in the direction from which he had come. As he sprinted away in terror for his life, he could hear the lion running behind him. He lunged ahead, running as fast as his legs could carry him. But he could still hear the lion right behind him, and then feel its breath on his back. In desperation, the tribesman veered off the path and began crashing through the thick bush. The lion chased him into a thicket of thorn shrubs. The razor-sharp prongs stuck in his feet and gashed his body. But he couldn't stop. Now other members of the pride had joined in the chase. The warrior could hear lions on either side of him, and he fancied he caught glimpses of them out the corners of his eyes. Eventually he came across another path, which he now tore along in complete disregard of his wounds and the painful stitch developing in his side and the loss of his sarong and beshu, which had been snatched from his waist by thorn bushes. By this time, the man did have a hunch that there were either no lions chasing him or that they weren't serious about catching him. After all, his logic told him that if it had wanted to, the original black-maned male would have caught him within seconds of him starting away from it. But this reasoning was dismissed by a more palpable reality in which he really was being chased by a whole pride of lions that were constantly on the verge of catching him. Some automatic force within him forced him to keep running. Things really started to get out of control when the new path he was on began leading down a steep hill. Now his toes stubbed on rocks and stones, and he struggled to keep his balance. As he picked up speed, his body got ahead of his wobbling legs, and he began tumbling down the hillside. Even as he rolled head over heels, he could not stop himself from running, and his knees and elbows kept bumping into the hard earth and stones, which explained why they were all dislocated. The last thing he remembered was a fierce blow cracking his skull and a fireworks display of stars going off in his mind. He had smashed head first into the leadwood tree at the bottom of the hill, where the herdsmen found him lying in a coma. I used to think this was the weirdest story I had ever heard. I knew that the uneducated tribespeople I had grown up around were very superstitious and capable of imagining the most bizarre supernatural events. It was quite normal even for a member of our domestic staff to turn up for work in the morning and matter-of-factly recount a terrifying encounter with some mythical creature during the night. But how, I asked myself, could anyone be so silly as to nearly kill themselves running away from a pride of imaginary lions? I finally got the answer when I started learning about creativity, and it has nothing to do with being silly. We have a process in our workshops we call the perception exercise, where people sit in pairs facing each other. The facilitator asks the participants to imagine their partner embodying different qualities, like being good and then bad, or being powerful and then powerless, trustworthy and then untrustworthy, and so on. What everyone notices is how, as they keep redefining the other person, their impression of that person changes in accordance with the changing definition. If it is a positive definition, the person will appear warm and benign, pleasant-looking even, and the one defining them will feel positively disposed towards them. If it is a negative definition, the other person will appear dark and malignant, unpleasant-looking, and seem to exude a repulsive energy. These impressions vary in intensity from person to person doing the exercise, in some cases slightly, with just a mild sense of the defined quality, or in others very palpably, with a drastic difference in sentiment and strong physiological changes to match the redefined quality. Generally, everyone gets it. Our perception of reality is not based on some objective comprehension of our situation, but rather on the definitions we are holding at any given time. As I've heard it said, we don't see things for what they are, we see them for what we are. In my trainings, I also like to show a movie called Howl's Moving Castle, a wonderful film about magic made by the Oscar-winning Japanese animation team Studio Ghibli. One of the features of the magician's castle is a front door that opens each time onto alternative settings, sometimes towns in different kingdoms, sometimes country fields, wastelands, battlegrounds, and night skies. Whatever world the door opens to is determined by a dial, which the castle residents set before opening the door. It's a very clever metaphor for the premise that our experience of the outer world is determined by the settings in our own consciousness, and that we have control of those settings. Of course, it's never explained what the dial in the castle actually represents, what it is that we set within ourselves that determines our reality, but with what I know about consciousness and magic, I'm betting its definition. Come to think of it, that tribesman who got chased by the imaginary lions, he and his kin, including our house servants, lived in a magical world much like the one in Howl's Moving Castle. Their world was defined as a supernatural realm, and that was their experience of it. Sorcerers snuck through their lands, blighting crops and sterilizing cattle. Demons rattled their roofs at night and broke down their doors to strangle them in their beds. Water spirits tried to abduct them when they bathed in rivers. Their enemies paid witch doctors to curse them with bad luck and pestilence, and they in turn paid other witch doctors to defend them and counter-curse their antagonists. Shamans travelled to other universes to fetch back stolen fragments of their souls. Everyone knew someone in their village who could turn themselves into some kind of animal, and many other things went on, some too dark to mention. They navigated a life fraught with dread and wonder. Now I understand how a native warrior, walking alone in the wilds, who is suddenly and without warning staring into the jaws of a roaring lion, the king of all predators, might unconsciously set a dial inside his mind, defining himself as dead meat. And I'm not surprised that from there, with his subconscious impregnated with that definition, he would begin creating a vivid reality of himself being lion prey, complete with sound, sensory, and visual effects. And that even though his logic might try to intervene and point out that the danger has passed, he couldn't switch off the scenario of being hunted and couldn't stop running for his life even as he somersaulted down a mountainside. I've seen an antelope being chased by lions right up close, seen the frantic desperation in its eyes as it drew on every ounce of its energy to pull away from its attackers. The tribesman had become that antelope. You might read about this native man's experience with an aloof detachment, as if you're regarding some anthropological curiosity that has no relevance to your modern, civilized mentality or experience. But just because you live in a world that is defined as a mechanical, cause and effect dimension and is dominated by rational scientific principles, doesn't mean you aren't subject to the same dynamics of the subconscious, or that you aren't using equal amounts of energy to make up equally fantastic scenarios. Trust me, you are. Just think. If we, in our technologically advanced society, are capable of creating patterns of experiences, like my brother Tony ending up in hospital every time I come near him, or like the woman I know who has a habit of falling in love with men about to succumb to a fatal blood-related illness, then what crazy perceptions are we not capable of forming? You are a reality manufacturing machine. Every moment you occupy is an experience of a reality you created. As you travel through life situation by situation, your ego, as the vehicle of your orientation, wants to know, how is it here? By answering that question, it can know how to operate in that environment. The problem is that the ego has no originality. It doesn't refer to the relevance of the moment. It doesn't look at the actual factors at play or the possibilities or potential in any situation. Instead, it looks at the unconscious beliefs you have that are relevant to the situation, and it communicates those beliefs to you through your thoughts and feelings. Your thoughts and feelings form a perception of what the reality of the situation is. Unquestionably, the most important thing you're being informed of unconsciously is what the situation means, and the meaning of any situation causes you to decide and behave accordingly. 3 different people could get pulled over by the police for speeding. One person might suddenly drive off in a panic and get chased and arrested for resisting the law. The second person might sit sullenly while the cops write them a ticket. The third driver might engage pleasantly with the police, who respond in kind and send them off with a warning. Of course, there could be many different variables at play in each scenario, but for illustration's sake, let's just say that the conditions are exactly the same in each situation. The first person's ego makes sense of the situation by checking with their belief system, which holds a self-definition of I am bad, a definition of authority as abusive, and a definition of the world as a dangerously volatile environment. Based on that unconscious set of definitions, this individual's sense of what will likely happen next is that they will be persecuted, and the same thoughts and feelings that tell them that also urgently propose they flee the scene. The second person's ego has a less disturbing take of the situation, but nevertheless one that still positions them as a powerless player. Their unconscious definitions of self, others, and the world are that they themselves are powerless, authority is overwhelmingly powerful, and the world is unfair. They feel that punishment is inevitable, and there is nothing they can do about it, other than glower silently to show their dissatisfaction with the rules of life. The third person, meanwhile, has a completely positive relationship to the same event. Just like the other two, their ego establishes how it is here by checking in with their belief system, but comes up with a completely different set of assumptions than the others did. Their unconscious definition of self is that they are likable when at a disadvantage. Authority is a tolerant force, and the world is a benign environment. As the policeman approaches, ticket book in hand, this driver feels a sense of elation. They're stirred to greet the officer cheerfully and happily acknowledge their error. The person's disarming disposition wears down the policeman's resolve to punish them, and the cop lets them off with a polite reminder of the dangers of breaking the speed limit. The above permutations of unconscious definitions can't be found in any textbook. They vary significantly from individual to individual, accounting for the uniqueness of our personalities. They do, however, serve to illustrate how we form our perceptions, and how those perceptions drive our behavior, and ultimately how we create a life condition resembling our beliefs. You've most probably heard the adage, in politics, perception is reality, or in advertising, perception is reality, or in Hollywood, perception is reality. The saying is used to suggest that a certain section of society is especially out of touch with reality. It implies that perception is not an accurate reflection of reality, but that in these worlds, people act as if it is. It's a marvelous aphorism, conveying so much in so few words, though applicable to all of us, not just the more evidently narcissistic cliques in society. Perception is not a reflection of objective reality. It is a reflection of the definitions we hold at any time, as communicated to us through our thoughts and feelings. It is so seamlessly built into our self-conscious awareness that questioning it seems absurd. After all, our other senses of sight and hearing and touch and smell and taste appear to be so reliable. Why not everything else we apprehend? And that is the advantage our ego has over our genius. Our perception is conveyed to us through our senses, and backed up by a solid history of consistent experiences. It makes palpable, tangible sense. Yet, in truth, what we think and feel is going on is a very limited and distorted view of what actually is going on. Later, when we cover personality types, I'm going to go into the various creatively counterproductive worldviews we get sucked into by our perceptions. For now, let's agree that if they are based on our unconscious beliefs, they will tend to be coloured by our physiological wounds and offer a low-level creative perspective and life orientation. Here, I just want to look at how we can neutralise our creatively low-level perception and shift into a high-level creative perspective. How do we prepare the fertile grounds for our genius to emerge? The answer is surprisingly simple. First, we must go back to asking ourselves, how is our low-level creative perception formed? The answer, of course, is that in needing to know how it is, in needing to understand and have everything worked out, the ego dips into our unconscious beliefs and then dredges up our predetermined definitions and assumptions and theories relating to our present situation, and communicates all of that to us through our thoughts and feelings. Our sense of the now is based more on memory than a direct apprehension of current reality. It's inescapable that perception will be our inevitable mode of awareness as long as we need to know how it is. So the next question then is, how can we neutralize our perception and shift into a genius state of consciousness, where our whole experience of reality is born of a refreshed and inspired relationship to the moment, rather than informed by what we made up in infancy and early childhood? And the answer, quite obviously, is don't know how it is. Let go of your need to understand and work everything out. Stop assuming that you have the answers or even need them. Stop making sense. When you consciously suspend your unconscious need to know, you enter into a state of innocence. I like to refer to it as in no sense, a place outside of thoughts and feelings. Innocence is a state of awe and wonder in which everything is either encountered for the first time or where awareness is not influenced by prior experience. This quality is what Jimi Hendrix was referring to in a Life magazine interview. A musician, if he's a messenger, is like a child who hasn't been handled too many times by men, hasn't had too many fingerprints across the brain. In the early 1990s, I was living in the inner Sydney suburb of Balmain when it was transformed from an industrial dockland into a chic harbourside residential area. One blustery winter's day, I was walking along the waterfront, chewing over a multitude of challenges confronting my life. The surroundings did nothing to uplift me. It was a time when global environmental consciousness was at its peak, and I couldn't help but feel disheartened by the signs of past and present ecological recklessness all around me. A row of dilapidated warehouses and factory buildings with stained walls and broken windows and crumbling smokestacks stood forlornly on the other side of the narrow bay. Rusty steel pipes cantilevered out over the bilgy water, evoking visions of toxic waste discharging wholesale into the harbour. Down at water level, the tide had receded, exposing grimy sand beaches covered in oil slicks. Jagged pieces of beer bottle glass were strewn across the sand, thanks to the mindless drunks who staggered down from the pub on the hill after closing time. Huge splotches of seagull shit adorned the sandstone promenade, while the culprits themselves perched morosely along the wharf railings, bracing themselves against the chill wind. The smell of shit and floating detritus and diesel fumes from boats idling on their moorings turned my stomach with every fresh gust. My only consolation was the solitude afforded by the grim weather, but even that was ruined by a noisy mob of preschool-aged children running towards me in advance of a young mother pushing a pram. She had a look of grim stoicism on her face that broadcasted her clear resolve to be unaffected by anything whatsoever, pleasant or unpleasant. To my horror and the mother's indifference, the kids bolted down a set of slimy sandstone steps onto the tarred beach below me. I winced at the thought of how dirty and dangerous it was down there, with all the oil and broken glass. Simultaneously, I felt a surge of pity for these suburban urchins forced to play in such an unnatural and polluted environment. The kids didn't care at all, though. As far as they were concerned, they were in Wonderland. "Wow," they squealed, pointing to the oil slicks. "Look, Mum, can you see the rainbows all over the sand down here?" Everything was amazing to them. Their eyes did not overlook a single detail of their surroundings, and all they saw impressed them. Bits of cyan and cobalt plastic, little crabs with eyes on stalks, bait fish shoaling in the shallows, even the broken glass. They held pieces of beer bottle up to the feeble sun, angling the glass fragments to achieve a prism effect, and then cried out in fresh wonder, "Wow, look at the colours! Look at the colours!" It struck me in that moment how distorted my outlook on life was. Here I was, immersed in the wonder of existence, standing at the centre of an extraordinarily multifarious universe, surrounded by a vast variety of life forms and the manifestations of mind-boggling creativity, both human and divine. Clouds were forming and dissolving. Birds were taking flight and landing. Voices rose loudly and then fell silent. The skies, the moment, my mind, everything was pregnant with possibility. Anything could have been born in that instant. But there I was, locked into my preconceived notion that life was hard, that winter was miserable, that the planet was choking to death, that humans were a blight on the landscape. In other words, I was weighed down by what I brought to that situation, not by the situation itself. Joseph Campbell, the mythology guru, made the observation that the mind catalogues information for convenience. It's a dynamic that we should be thankful for. To have to relearn the meaning of all things in our environment every time we encounter them would be a massive waste of energy, not to mention be life-threatening. When I'm back in Africa, for instance, walking along a path in the bush, it's handy that I already have my surroundings figured out. I won't startle in fright at the warble of a thrush in the undergrowth, and I won't hang around to get bitten by an angry snake as that loud rustling in the tall grass moves inexorably towards me. There are some obvious drawbacks to this cataloguing function, of course. Qualitatively, it makes us stale and depressed. Every day, new blossoms bloom in our gardens, but we don't appreciate them fully because our rational minds assume, unconsciously, that we know all there is to know about flowers. We hug our loved ones, but the warmth of that connection won't sink in too deep because, again, we figure we don't have anything more to learn about these existing connections. Rationally, we don't want to fully absorb any experience we assume won't teach us anything new. We perceive things vaguely, not in any detail, because the details supposedly already exist in our catalogue. So our experiences and relationship to people and things become very shallow, very bland, which then causes us to dry up inside. We no longer have a vital, living, breathing connection to life, but instead live out of a suitcase of musty experiences we packed many years ago. Creatively, the uninterrupted reference we make to our unconscious catalogue keeps us oblivious to our genius perspective and input. By not needing to be fully present, we're not aware of the deeper levels of reality in our field of self-conscious awareness. We filter out a swathe of objective details that are relevant to us in the moment, whether it be visual imagery or mental ideas or a certain sense of something. That which is so obviously standing out, begging to be realized, is pushed back into the dim recesses of awareness in favor of a convenient, preconceived summary of current reality. What would truly serve us to be aware of, what might be in our greater interest to be involved in, what could be more pleasing or effective, escapes us. The perversity of a total capitulation to our rational cataloguing function is beautifully summed up by author Bob Samples, who, when presenting his interpretation of Einstein's perspective on intuition, wrote, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift." I am no religious scholar, but in the Bible, when Jesus is tempted by the devil, he says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Metaphorically, he might well be commanding his unconscious catalogue to stand back in order to allow his superconscious input to move to the forefront of his awareness. We can very easily put the faithful servant back in his place and get Satan to get himself behind us. All we have to do is suspend our need to be in the know. When we do that, when we allow ourselves to be in the mystery, we cut ourselves off from our rote catalogue, and we're suddenly more fully connected to our current reality. We go into in no sense. The condition of innocence can be described as a refreshed, heightened state of appreciation. Everything seems to stand out, become more vivid and alive. Our immediate and intimate connection to whatever we behold gives it a wondrous quality. Beauty is bestowed on our world by the novel and unique light we see it in. Time apparently stands still as our senses soak up the marvelous details of our experience, just as it did for those kids playing on the polluted beach while their mother and I grappled unhappily with the problematic definitions and meaning served up by our well-thumbed catalogues. Innocence is definitely a childlike condition, but don't for a moment confuse it with childish naivety or ignorance. Wise men and women throughout history have revered innocence as the basis of our creative power. You'll find references to it everywhere, in religious texts, alchemical principles, the verses of the Romantic poets, the Grail myth, and even in our modern-day mythology. In the epic sci-fi movie Star Wars, when the young hero Luke Skywalker is making his final do-or-die bombing run over the evil Empire's Death Star, he hears the voice of his mentor, Obi-Wan Kenobi's spirit, urging him to "Use the Force, Luke. Let go, Luke." Luke shuts down his starfighter's onboard computer system and syncs his mind with the mystical universal force, which then guides him to fly and target the Death Star instinctively. If ever there was a nod to the premise of shifting from the mechanically driven mode of perception to the mystically connected mode of intuition, this is it. By suspending his reliance on his pre-programmed rational intelligence system, Luke prepares his mind to receive the inspired direction of his own genius. So too for us, Innocence is the bridge to our intuition. For an audio of an Innocence guided meditation, please go to williamwhitecloud.com/natural success bonus. Probably the most revered character in Japanese history is the legendary 17th century swordsman Shinmen Takezo, better known as Miyamoto Musashi. His fighting ability was on a par with that of his French counterpart, Cyrano de Bergerac, though while de Bergerac's exploits are mostly fictional, Musashi's were mostly for real. He is said to have single-handedly taken on 100 men at a time and killed them all. His prowess owed to a phenomenal natural ability, ferocious focus, and a complete reliance on instinct over technique. In the Book of Five Rings, which he wrote in retirement, Musashi repeatedly remarks that technical flourishes are excessive and drives home the principle that technique has less value than focusing on the end result of cutting down one's opponent. I don't recall too many specifics from the book, other than the chilling advice that the best way to unnerve your opponent is by stabbing straight at his face. Musashi's career ran concurrently with that of another great swordsman, the dashing Sasaki Kojiro, who went by the fighting name of Ganryu. Unlike Musashi, Ganryu was a big fan of technique. He was the arch-exponent of the Kenjutsu style of sword fighting, using a long two-handed sword and dispatching his opponents with a move he had perfected by cutting down flying swallows. Like Musashi, Ganryu had triumphed in many epic duels, and there was great debate and speculation in the whole of Japan as to which of them was the supreme fighter, though the odds favoured Ganryu because of his long blade advantage. In a world where no warrior's reputation went unchallenged, it was inevitable that the two greatest swordsmen of their time would have to face each other sooner or later. And so it came to pass that a duel between them was arranged. A date was set for the 13th of April 1612, and the rules of engagement were carefully negotiated. To avoid any treachery by the competing teams, it was decided that they would fight it out on a small island in the middle of a lake, where there could be no surprise attacks by either of the combatants' henchmen. Both swordsmen would be rowed out to the island, where they would be left to do battle on their own. The rules provided for the duelists to go out separately the day before to look the island over. Ganryu took advantage of the opportunity to familiarize himself with the terrain. Musashi demurred, saying that he did not want to go into the fight with any preconceived notions whatsoever. The duel between Ganryu and Musashi was one of the greatest spectacles in samurai history. A grandstand was built around the lake to accommodate the hordes of spectators coming to witness this fight to the death between two living legends. At the appointed time, on the appointed day, Ganryu was ferried out to the little island, from where he acknowledged the cheers of the excited crowd. Musashi, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Hours passed, and still he did not show up. Ganryu paced the spit of earth in rage. Speculation was rife among the spectators that Musashi had chickened out for fear of having no answer to his opponent's long two-handed sword. By the time the sun began its descent into the western sky, and it was starting to register with onlookers that there would be no fight, people began to allow that they had never believed Musashi was any match for Ganryu anyway, and weren't surprised that, when it came down to it, he had run away with his tail between his legs. Some 3 hours after his nemesis had set out from the lake shore to the island, Musashi finally deigned to turn up. No student of the famous duel is in doubt that his tardiness was entirely calculated to rile Ganryu. After all, his whole aim in every conflict was to remain still and centered within himself, and at the same time spook his opponents into reaction. Even so, as he climbed into the rowing boat that would transport him to his waiting adversary, Musashi was nursing concerns about how he might overcome Gun-Ryu's long blade advantage. How would he get close enough to his opponent without being taken out by the fabled turning swallow cut? The boatman took up his oars and began rowing the boat in the direction of the island. A jeer went up in the stands, partly as a rebuke to Musashi for his blatant disrespect, but also in elated anticipation of the epic duel the crowd was finally on the verge of witnessing. After all, this was Rumble in the Jungle, medieval Japan style. The great swordsman ignored the jeers and concentrated instead on calming his mind. As he did so, the thing that came to his attention was that there was a spare oar in the boat. A long, slender pole with a paddle blade at one end, longer than Gun-Ryu's Nodachi sword. Without hesitating, Musashi took out his own sword and began whittling away at the pole, chopping off the paddle blade and, as best he could, fashioning the oar into the semblance of a blunt, wooden sword. When Musashi reached the island, Gun-Ryu stood seething next to the waterline with the sinking sun in his eyes. The Kenjutsu master watched Musashi get out of the boat holding an oar. He drew his sword from its scabbard and threw the scabbard aside with a curse. In that moment, Musashi had his rival at a complete disadvantage. Gun-Ryu was hopping mad, he had the sun in his eyes, and he was expecting Musashi to put the oar down and draw his own sword. Instead, from out of reach of the long blade, Musashi swung his crude oar sword with all his might, landing a blow on Gun-Ryu's side which crushed his pelvis. Gun-Ryu went down in a heap. Musashi took a step forward and caved in his fallen opponent's head with another swing of the oar sword. Musashi walked back to the boat that had brought him and was about to climb in. As an afterthought, he turned and bowed to Gun-Ryu's prone body and then climbed into the boat, nodding to the boatmen to row him back to the mainland. It was Musashi's last fight ever, and Gun-Ryu's. We don't hear about this story much in relation to creative or intuitive development, although we should. In the same way that Wag Dodge was able to make a creative leap of incredible magnitude when he took an instinctive stand against the reactive compulsions of his emotions, Musashi was able to consistently operate on a high-level creative frequency by being so fiercely disciplined in not allowing himself to be influenced by preconceived strategies, techniques, or theories and concepts. As a result of his value of living in no sense, Musashi always had the advantage of recognizing the most effective pathway in any undertaking, as well as the ability to have his natural ability bring things together in a way he could never have engineered rationally or self-consciously. The legendary swordsman's genius, like most real genius, was not a function of brilliant deductive reasoning, but rather the opposite, an ability to let go of working everything out and, from there, recognizing superconscious input as it arose. This is, in fact, the creative principle of receiving. Receiving is one of the most important aspects of high-level creative function, something we can only embody when we let go of needing to have everything worked out. Often enough, I've heard the saying, let go and let God, and I'm not sure whether those who utter the phrase know how profound it actually is. Wise people as diverse as Albert Einstein and Joseph Campbell tell us that our rational brain is really a secondary organ designed for objective analysis. As marvelous as it is at that function, we know it has the drawback of working with a set of information that is limited by the extent of our linear experience and the scope of our biases. In the 2004 quantum physics documentary or feature film, What the Bleep Do We Know?, one of the featured experts, Dr. Joe Dispenza, claims that the human brain processes 400 billion bits of information every second, while we are only self-consciously aware of 2,000 bits. That's a massive discrepancy. Just like a judge rules at the beginning of a trial what evidence can and cannot be used in the court case, so there must be some part of our brain deciding what, of all eternity, we should be allowed to see at any time. And I'm betting that it's the same 2,000 bits that we always see. Those that fit in with and make sense of what we already know about how it is from before. Rationally, we don't stand much chance of coming up with anything different than our unconscious beliefs of how it is. That transcendent function belongs to the superconscious mind, the part of us connected to and capable of processing everything through all time and space. Yet in our society, as Bob Samples said, the rational mind has usurped the role of the superconscious. We tend to live our lives by trying to work them out, never realizing why we might be so stuck in such an unsatisfying experience of our careers, or lifestyles, or relationships, or social involvement, or health, or creative expression. The harder people try to give up their addictions, or overcome their financial problems, or hang on to their relationships, or control their lives, the more their problems seem to compound. Which is why every time someone just lets go and lets God, it's such an incredibly liberating feeling, and so often leads to the person creating a better situation for themselves. One quote that apparently can be safely attributed to Einstein is, "No problem can be solved by the same kind of thinking that created it." When anyone gives up trying to hold their life together, they are inevitably giving up rational control, which suspends their unconscious referencing and allows their natural ability some room to move. No offense to anyone's religious beliefs, but what may seem like the miraculous hand of God taking over is likely to be the person's own genius filling the breach. Generally, it's true that the less we insist on how we assume things have to be, the more brilliantly our lives tend to flow. Have you heard that great saying, "Would you rather be right or would you rather be happy?" On a trip I recently took back to Australia, a friend of mine reminded me of the phenomenally successful business he created using the tools he had learned from me in my first-generation training, Living from Greatness, way back at the end of the 90s. Most specifically, the principle of receiving. Fergus Herbert certainly fits the description maverick entrepreneur. Fergus has made his fortune by getting involved in the most unlikely ventures, ranging from publishing to buying a gold mine, to owning jatropha plantations, to developing unconventional properties, to aquafarming. Around the time of the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers in New York, Fergus was running a disruptive valve technology company from his offices in the iconic Sydney landmark, the Manly Bathers Pavilion, which he had just bought and was in the process of redeveloping. One day, he got a call from an MBA graduate who had interned for him at Global Valve Technology. The young man wasn't happy with his current employment situation and wanted to know if Fergus knew of any good positions available in the management world. Fergus told him, in his genial way, that he didn't, but he'd let him know if something came up. Just minutes after he hung up on his former intern, the phone rang again. This time it was a friend of his who was about to lose his job selling advertising. He too was wondering if Fergus knew of any work in his area of expertise. As with the intern, he had to tell his friend that he didn't, but he'd let him know if something came up. Fergus remembers thinking what a coincidence it was, being called minutes apart by two highly competent executives looking for work. But that isn't where it ended. A little while later, his phone rang again. Incredibly, it was another friend calling to find out if Fergus knew anyone who needed any graphic design work done, because things were pretty desperate in his field at the time. He had to tell the graphic designer exactly what he had told the last two callers. From everything I know about Fergus, he's an affable guy as well as highly pragmatic. While on the one hand he really wished he could do something for his friends, he also regretted seeing so much talent going to waste. Before the end of the day, an idea came to him, and he called back all three men and invited them to a meeting at his office the following day, hinting that he might have some work for them. When they turned up for the meeting at the Bathers Pavilion, each of them was equally surprised to learn that it was not a private meeting with Fergus. Their suspicion and disappointment were soon allayed, however, when he told them that he had an idea for a business that would involve each of their diverse talents. "Oh, great!" they all chimed excitedly. "What is it?" "Well, that's the thing," Fergus said with a rakish grin and raised finger. The trio sat forward in their seats. "I don't know." The three men looked around at each other, confounded. "But you just told us you had an idea for a business that could use all of our talents," his would-be partners balked. "How can we go into business if you haven't even got one in mind?" "Well, that's the thing," Fergus explained. "We're going to find a business." "Are you nuts, mate?" one of the others exclaimed. "This isn't the right time in the economic cycle to be starting a business." Another put up his hands and said flatly, "I haven't got any money to put into a business. I'm out." "How will we ever find a business that suits all four of us?" the third one frowned. After withstanding a tirade of doubts and objections, Fergus put his idea to his friend. Here's the plan. We go into business as equal partners. We'll give it 1 month to find exactly the right business for all of us. I don't know how we'll find it. We're not going to try to work it out. We're going to hang with the tension until it comes to us, and when it does, we'll know it when we see it. If anyone other than Fergus had put this plan to them, the 3 men would have walked out there and then. But because of his track record of putting successful deals together in the most unorthodox ways, they were at least disposed to considering his proposal. Now that he had them interested, Fergus made them an offer none of them could refuse. I'll put up whatever money is needed, and I'll pay your salaries for a year as a... They were all in. Their first order of business was to form a company called Knights of the Round Table, and next they set up a temporary office in the Bathers' Pavilion. Enthusiasm was running high. Of course, none of them had any experience with waiting, and every day found one or more of the partners coming to work with some venture for the others to consider. Fergus watched with a detached amusement as the usual suspects of fast food franchises, investment schemes, bankruptcy notifications, and hot tips were paraded through the boardroom. Everyone was doing their heads in, trying to force a suitable opportunity through the 1-month window Fergus had set. The walls of their office were plastered with flip chart sheets, cataloguing the business models and numbers relating to all the schemes they were coming up with. But nothing anyone brought in managed to excite a majority of the shareholders. Every time one of his partners asked him in exasperation how they were going to find the right business, Fergus had the same answer. I don't know. As the deadline approached, everyone's enthusiasm began turning to despair. They consoled themselves and each other with the fact that they had lost nothing more than a few weeks of their time. Though they were all disappointed, no one harbored any hard feelings. With a week still left to the agreed deadline, the partners started thinking about looking for work outside of the Round Table again. 2 days before the month was up, the graphic designer came to Fergus, desperate for some work. He asked Fergus to think of anyone he could approach who might be able to give him a lead. Fergus suggested he talk to an acquaintance of his, Gil, who had some publishing interests. The designer went to see Gil the same day and came back to the office just before the close of business to collect his personal effects. He didn't expect he'd ever be coming back. "So, did he have anything for you?" Fergus said when he saw the designer. "No," the man replied dejectedly, "but he asked if you can go see him." Seeing as though Gil's offices were nearby to his own, Fergus decided to drop in on him first thing the following morning. As he walked into Gil's office, the businessman dispensed with all pleasantries and asked Fergus bluntly, "Have you got $2 in your pocket?" "I think so," said Fergus, taken aback. "Why? Do you want me to go grab you a coffee?" "No," Gil waved the suggestion away. "It's what I want for 2 of my magazines." Turned out that Gil had 2 magazines, a regional airlines in-flight magazine and a cruise lines journal that he was losing money publishing. He proposed Fergus take them off him in return for $2 and 50% of future profits. Fergus, having cut his teeth in the early days as a publisher, instinctively knew he had found the unicorn he and his friends were looking for. It had, as he said it would, come to him, on the last day of the deadline, too. Just as Musashi had, he took decisive action. Without bothering to look at any numbers, he countered with an offer of $2 and 6.5% of Knights of the Round Table. Gil accepted. As soon as he got back to the Bathers' Pavilion, Fergus summoned his partners. "Okay, lads," he told them once they had all gathered, "we're in business. Here's the deal. The in-flight magazine goes to press later today. We have advertising sales of $20,000 and production costs of $25,000. We've got a few hours to get costs down and sell more advertising." The advertising executive worked the phones that day and brought in $2,000 in advertising. By the time the magazine went to press, Fergus had found a way to cut production costs by $5,000. They had just bought a business for $2 and in 4 hours made a profit of $2,000. From there, they took the in-flight magazine from a quarterly to a monthly publication. Not only that, they began acquiring other airlines' in-flight magazines. Soon they were doing so well that they were able to buy another iconic landmark in Manly, a former Masonic lodge known as the Temple, for just under $2 million. If you are familiar with the esoteric origins of the Freemasons, you will appreciate the delicious irony of this acquisition. Once the Knights of the Round Table set up office in the temple, they began expanding their media business even further. The centerpiece of their enterprise was a digital agency called Edge, which was named by Business Review Weekly as Australia's fastest-growing company many years in a row. Within a decade, the temple was home to 70 employees and operations turning over $20 million annually. The story doesn't end there. Leveraging their success with the original business, the individual partners were able to create other lucrative projects reflecting their own private interests and expertise. Most notable of these is King Content, a content marketing agency which ultimately sold for a staggering amount of money that I am not at liberty to disclose. And herein, folks, is a case study in magic, especially relating to the principle of receiving. Though, I must say, this story is a gift that keeps on giving. I will make reference to it in the next 2 chapters, following through and using the emotion of the true end result. But for now, let me just reiterate. When we operate on a high-level creative frequency, we harmonize with the miraculous nature of existence and bring into being extraordinary creations that defy our expectations of what is possible and simultaneously enrich ourselves and all that we are a part of. Applying his own genius, Fergus not only made a ton of money, he also created opportunities for an untold number of others, and even beyond that, generated the resources to invest in many socially uplifting and environmentally sustainable projects. It really is a beautiful thing. As you can see from the Musashi myth and the example of my talented business friend Fergus, Innocence should not be associated with childish naivety and ignorance. Operating in a way where we have loosened our grip on needing to understand and have everything worked out can and should be applied to military strategy, business development, sports performance, artistic endeavor, learning, innovation, scientific research, leadership, conflict resolution, relationships, quality of life, and absolutely any and every area of human interest or activity. But it's not as easy as it sounds. The thing that Musashi and Fergus have in common is that they had both intentionally developed their mode of awareness known as intuition. And you'll need to develop and practice your intuition if you mean to apply it in any consistent and masterful way. I don't mean to be arrogant, but I do laugh when I read scholarly articles on intuition, and the authors still frame it in terms of a sixth sense, hunches, and gut feelings, as though it's a vague and intermittent dynamic that visits us at its own pleasure or whim. That's like saying that no matter how well you learn to speak Portuguese and you travel to Brazil, you'll only be able to catch snatches of what the locals are saying on random occasions rather than have fluent conversations the whole time. Please, intuition is one of our primary modes of awareness, constantly available and accessible at will. Though, I must say, to begin with, your rational mind will be a lot happier about you learning Portuguese than it will be about coexisting with your intuition. Perhaps if I give you a dictionary definition of intuition, you will understand the challenge one faces in being able to master it. What the mind immediately apprehends before rationalizing. Do you see the problem? In going into Innocence, information that doesn't normally occur to you suddenly stands out. Super-rational knowing can come in many different forms. The cliched gut feeling or funny sense of something, vague impressions, obvious knowing, symbolic association, imagery, colors or lights, physical sensations. There is no limit to the variety of ways in which genius, insight, and inspiration show up. It is neither possible nor necessary to have a catalogue of every potential cognitive vessel the information will be contained in. If you are trained in intuition, you will recognize and allow yourself to receive any sign of latent wisdom the moment you become aware of it. If you are untrained, you will self-consciously do what you are always unconsciously doing. Wipe your mind clear of anything that doesn't make sense to your rational mind. In other words, though an infinite quantity of information is dawning on you, you will continue to rationalize everything to fit in with what you know from the past. Your rational mind makes sure that nothing more than your pre-selected, pre-approved 2000 bits survive the light of self-conscious awareness. A friend of mine once told me an interesting story related to this dynamic. When he was a boy, he lived with his family in South Australia, in an area known for its high level of UFO activity. One clear sunny day, he was driving back home from somewhere with his father, when they both witnessed a formation of lights come flying at them head-on and then veer off the highway and disappear into the sky, just in time to avoid collision. Both he and his father were shaken by the experience. After all, something of an otherworldly nature, travelling at lightning speed, had nearly crashed into them. At first, my friend recounted, he and his dad were incredulous. They did that thing we all do when startled. "Did you see that?" "Yes." "Did you see that?" "Yes." "What was that?" "I don't know." "Do you know?" "What do you think?" After the initial shock wore off, they both felt elated at the shared experience of a close encounter with an evidently extraterrestrial object. Both father and son used the term UFO in referring to what they had just seen. Soon, my friend's father's common sense kicked in. "Well," he said, "we don't know what it was. It could have been anything. Could have been Foo Fighters, those orbs of light that followed bomber planes at high altitudes in the war, or balloons. Whatever it was very strange. Gave us a good fright, hey, son?" They ended up agreeing that whatever it was they had seen, there had to be some logical, non-phenomenological explanation for it, although they still agreed that it had been an incredible experience. But when they got home, and my friend ran inside to tell the rest of the family what had happened to them on the road, his father refused to back up his story. He denied point blank that they had seen anything at all, never mind anything out of the ordinary. Even years later, when my friend asked his father in private why he had denied the mysterious experience, his old man refused to acknowledge that something had happened and dismissed his son's memory of the incident as the product of an overactive imagination. That's a cruel thing to happen to a boy. Why my friend's father didn't back him up isn't something I can definitively explain, but his denial of the incident serves to illustrate perfectly how the rational mind whittles down reality to fit in with its preconceived notion of how it is. First, something comes into awareness. It is subjectively apprehended by the mind, and then the process of rationalization begins. While usually this editing is happening at the blink of an eye, the father's repression mechanism can be seen here in slow motion. To begin with, the mind recognizes the object just for what it is. As originally noted, the father and son referred openly to what they had seen as a UFO. Next, the mind tries to square the object with what it knows from before. The father began to explain the phenomenon in terms of what, in his linear experience, could have caused it. Foo Fighters, or balloons floating on the highway. If the object can fit in with the mind's worldview, then it will survive in self-conscious awareness, albeit in the subjective context it has been squeezed into. If it doesn't fit in with the mind's worldview, it is wiped clean from self-conscious awareness. What is interesting is that the father could fit the experience into the framework of his past understanding. Foo Fighters, balloons, light reflecting off something on the Nullarbor Plain perhaps. Considering that his son also saw something, it's feasible that a weird incident of some kind did actually occur. Yet the father ended up denying the entire experience, and apparently not just in the sense that he simply refused to admit it, but in that he ended up truly having no recollection of it. In that case, another kind of rationalizing influence is likely at work, conforming tendency. In their book on institutional change, Presence, authors Betty Sue Flowers, Joseph Jaworski, Otto Scharmer and Pete Senge point out that further than our minds needing to establish how it is individually, we also have a fundamental social need to agree on how it is. All young children are aware of otherworldly beings like fairies and pixies. They all see angels above their beds or little green men at the window. In many cultures, even today, these demonic entities, considered intermediaries between the physical and metaphysical planes, are commonly accepted as normal. But as children grow up in our society, they fall into agreement with the adults whom they are catching up with that there are no such things, to the point that they forget they ever saw them. If my friend and his father belonged to a skeptical social group who strongly refuted the validity of any type of phenomenon, then I can understand how the father's conforming tendency was the final determinant in banishing the close encounter he had with a UFO from his self-conscious reality altogether. This is one of the challenges you will face trying to apply your intuition. You may well go into Innocence and suddenly become aware of a whole lot of new information. But if that information does not fit in with what you have psychically agreed on with your peer group, or match your sense of self, or others, or the world, or possibility, or if you didn't come by the information through a linear process such as a chain of events, or hearing it from someone else, or if it contradicts conventional wisdom or the face value of anything, you're going to throw those realizations under the bus of rationalization quicker than you can count to one. The rational mind, I must warn you, is a fierce guardian of its domain. It jealously serves the ego in keeping you orientated, holding you to a perception consistent with your beliefs about how it is. If you ever begin entertaining input from outside its purview, the rational mind will use extreme methods, if necessary, to make sure you let the foreign impressions go. Normally, you won't even notice the shame or doubt or anxiety or depression or sense of emptiness arising as new realities dawn on you, because you tend to dismiss those realities before they ever occur to you in self-conscious awareness. But you can be sure you'll notice the tension as soon as you do become cognizant of nonsensical realities, and you can rely on the tension ratcheting up to unbearable levels the longer you sit with the nonsense. In The Search for the Real Self, psychiatrist James Masterson, MD, refers to this kind of pain as abandonment depression. He doesn't mean depression in the strict sense of the word, using the term to include all negative emotions that arise when we begin to stray from and ignore our conditioned sense of self. The mystic, George Gurdjieff, who influenced modern psychology with his concepts of higher consciousness, saw these tensions as buffers that cushion us from the psychological turmoil that ensues when our identity is challenged. Mythology also has a lot to say about our psychological reluctance to embrace whatever lies further afield of our certainly established world. Anyone who's familiar with the work of J.R.R. Tolkien knows that hobbits are not allowed to leave the cosy, pleasant climes of their beloved Shire. Terror lives beyond its borders, and Tolkien tells us plainly what that terror is when he describes hobbits as little people who love to read books full of things they already know about. I don't want to give the rational mind the power. Your creative spirit is infinitely more powerful. Nevertheless, psychological resistance to the new is a fact of life that is best faced rather than swept under the carpet. Living life on a high-level creative frequency is a freedom you have to fight for. This is what it means to be a creative warrior. It takes a fierce dedication to just notice reality without jumping to what it means. This is a skill I call, quite literally, observing the obvious. People use the word obvious all the time, though few are ever really functionally aware of it. The obvious is what plainly jumps out at you and stays with you in objective form. Great power will come to anyone who can learn to be present to whatever is without needing to understand what they apprehend, no matter how perplexing or confronting. I guarantee that the ability to observe the obvious will improve your powers of creative awareness 100 times. When I teach intuition, just about the most powerful technique I introduce my participants to is one where they observe someone talking